I welcome you all to the module 6. So, the module 6 is about thinking and intelligence, and this is the second lecture of this module, and overall this is lecture number 15. So, today's lecture is titled as Intelligence, Nature and Theories. So, in today's lecture we will be focusing on the concept of intelligence, the basic ideas around intelligence and some basic theories. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me brief recap of the last lecture. So, last lecture 14 was also part of the same module, where we introduced the concept of thinking, what are the contents of thinking, what are the different types of thinking, how we use thinking to solve problems, and what is the relationship between creativity and problem solving, and at the end we discussed how can we use some of these ideas to enhance creativity in our real life or in our day-to-day functionings. So, in today's lecture we will talk about the concept of intelligence. What is the meaning of intelligence? And we will also see the debates of nature versus nurture debate in the context of intelligence. To what extent intelligence is contributed by the genetics, and to what extent it is shaped by the environment. And at the end we talk about some of the major theories of intelligence. So, let us start today's lecture. Now, what is intelligence? It is not easy to answer this kind of questions, because these are this will come under something called as a natural concept that we discussed in the last lecture, that some concepts they do not have a defined boundaries, they are not easy to define, because there may be a lot of perspective involved in it. So, intelligence is one such concept, it can be complex and philosophical to answer such or define such a concept. Psychologist questions whether intelligence is a single objective entity that can be precisely measured, or whether it is a subjective culturally influenced construct, something that depends on how different societies or individuals value certain types of thinking on problem solving. Is it really an objective thing, intelligence, or is it really a cultural subjective thing that people value in certain societies, something then that if you show that, people will say you are intelligent. What is it? Is it an objective entity, or is it a subjective entity or cultural construct? So, a lot of ideas are like people have been struggling with that idea. So, intelligence may not have a very universal definitions in terms of accepted by everyone. It may have a mix of both objective ability and subjective interpretations. So, when we define intelligence or this kind of term, it is very difficult to define it in such a way that everybody accepts that, but then people somehow find some middle ground and then take a definition which is used for research and so on. So, intelligence is also such concept which can have both objective as well as subjective aspects to its definition. Now, as we said, defining intelligence is not easy, which can be understood from varieties of definition that has been given. For example, here are some of the attempts to define intelligence. One is, intelligence is the mental abilities that enable one to adapt to, shape or select one's environment. So, this is one definition. It is a mental ability or capacity which help you to adapt, to shape or select things in your environment according to what you need. Another definition is the ability to deal with novel situations. Whenever a new situation comes, how are you able to deal with it? That reflects your intelligence. The ability to judge, comprehend and reason. Are you able to make judgment properly? Are you able to understand things? Are you able to reason logically? That is a reflection of intelligence. So, this is another definition. The ability to understand and deal with people, objects and symbols is another way to define it. The ability to act purposefully, think rationally and deal effectively with the environment. So, this is one of the most accepted definition that we also kind of focus on. So, there are varieties of ways a same concept can be defined. The different definition may include the diverse ideas around it. However, obviously there is nothing like universally accepted such definitions, because there are many concepts which are used which are very difficult to concretely define. All this definition has terms such as judge, comprehend, understand, think rationally. These are all very fuzzily defined concept, ill defined concept. What is the meaning of rational thinking? What is the meaning of understanding? So, you can have multiple interpretation around them, and all this definition uses those terms. So, that creates the complexity. However, one of the most accepted definition in the psychology comes from somebody named as David Wetzler, who described intelligence as the global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, think rationally, and to deal effectively with the environment. This is one of the definition which kind of captures a lot of things that we understand when we use the word intelligence. So, it is a capacity, global capacity in most of the things that we do of an individual, acting purposefully. Whenever you do some actions, can you purposefully act logically, purposefully, whatever is the requirement of a situation? Can you think rationally? Whenever a situation arises, can you think logically, step by step, whatever is required? So, that is a reflection of intelligence. And deal effectively with the environment. Whenever a situation arises, can we deal with the situation? These are all reflections of intelligence. Acting purposefully, thinking rationally, and dealing effectively with the environment. While some psychologists view intelligence as a single general ability, other argues there are multiple forms of intelligence. So, there are also debates that we look into that. There are lot of psychologists believe that this is a single general ability. If you are intelligent, then you are intelligent in most of the things that we do. So, this is a general ability. Other argue that intelligence is not one thing. There are multiple types of intelligences. So, we will look into some of these things. Now, one of the important debates in the context of intelligence is nature versus nurture debate. Means to what extent intelligence is genetically determined and to what extent it is determined by the environment in which we are brought up. So, which has more contribution? So, scientists have long sought to answer these questions whether intelligence primarily a result of nature or genetics or nurture or the environment. From where this comes, from where this ability comes? Is it from the genetics or is it from the environment? A substantial body of research indicate that intelligence has a strong genetic basis. Lot of research shows that there is a strong genetic basis. Remember the word strong. It is not saying it is fully determined. Nothing is fully determined by the genetics, particularly in the psychological context. But there is a very strong genetic basis. It means genetics plays very important role. The closer the genetic relationship, the higher the IQ correlations, with the strongest similarity found among monozygotic twins even when raised apart. So, that means research shows that people who are genetically close to each other, their IQ are more similar to each other. The more genetically close are there, more IQ similarity. That means genetics plays some role. Therefore, people who are genetically same, their IQ scores also are more similar. And they found the highest similarity among monozygotic twins, even when raised apart. What does that mean? Monozygotic twins. Monozygotic twins are twins who are very identical. So, we might have seen there are twins who look exactly same. Other people cannot, outside people cannot distinguish who is who. They look exactly same. These are called identical twins or monozygotic twins. Why they look exactly same? Because their genetic composition is exactly same. They are 100% same genetically. Now, researchers, whenever they try to understand the contribution of genes, this kind of twins are the best to study to find out the role of gene in a particular trait. However, one problem remains that if they are in the same family, environment is also same. They are genetically exactly same, but environment is also same because they are reared in the same family and they look exactly alike. So, the treatment of other people will be very similar. So, then also we cannot kind of separate the influence of environment from the genetics. So, researchers try to find out monozygotic twins when they are raised different families for whatever reasons, reared apart. So, a lot of researchers could look at such twins who are born initially and after the birth they are raised apart, means one of the twin went to some other family either it was adopted by someone or some other reasons, whatever it is, within few months of after the birth. Now, very clearly we can find out the contribution of genes and environment, because the environment is very different. Both are raised in a completely different environment, but genetically they are 100% same. So, despite this different environment, if they show similarity in their IQ scores, that means we can say genetic is playing more role than the environment. So, studying this it is one of the best sample to study in terms of separating the influence of gene from the environment. So, researcher shows when they found strongest similarity in monozygotic twins, even when they are raised apart, they were found very similar in their genetic in their IQ scores. Dizygotic twins and biological siblings show moderate correlation. Dizygotic twins means these are twins who are twins, but they are not exactly same. So, their genetic similarity is 50% same. Monozygotic twins, their genetic contribution is 100% same. So, as compared to dizygotic or non-identical twins, identical twins, their similarity of IQ scores are much more stronger, even when they are raised in different families. So, this shows a lot of evidence that genetics plays very strong role in the intelligence of human beings. Adoption studies further also confirmed genetic influence. Adopted children's IQ correlate more strongly with their biological parents. So, even though they are adopted, when adopted children were looked at their IQ scores, whether it is similar to their biological parents or their adopted parents, they found they are more similar to their biological parents. This also gives some evidence that genetics is playing strong role in terms of determining the intelligence. However, that does not mean environment does not play any role. It only plays, genetics has a very strong role. That means it is not 100%, but there is a large percentage of proportion of variance in the IQ scores can be explained by the genetics. However, environment factor also play a very important role. Monozygotic twins reared together have more similar IQs than those raised apart. So, researcher also found when identical twins are reared in the same family and when they are reared in the different families, the IQ score correlation also differs. When they are reared in the same family, their IQ score similarity is more than when they are raised apart. Although, even if in the case of raised apart, there is a very strong correlation, but the correlation is stronger in case of when they are in the same family, which says the effect of upbringing also plays role. The environment, family environment or whatever the environment there also plays important role. Research also shows some programs such as early education, preschool intervention, interactive parent-child reading have been shown to raise children's IQ. So, in many times intelligence is also not can be raised by giving the right kind of environment. So, that also shows environment plays important role. Okay. So, overall genes and environment interact in a complex ways to shape intelligence. Both plays very important role. So, genetics can give you certain potentials, but if you do not get the right kind of environment, those potential will not be expressed. You may have a very great potential to become, let us say, scientist, but if you do not get the right kind of education, right kind of university atmosphere and so on, your ability will not be expressed. So, environment also plays very important role. Genetics only can give you certain potentials, but whether those potentials are realized, expressed, that depends on the environment. So, in that sense they interact in a very complex ways to shape the way IQ scores are reflected. The heritability of IQ is estimated about 50%, meaning that roughly half of the difference in IQ scores in a population are due to genetics, while rest can be environmental influences. So, in a population level, broadly we can say about 50% is contributed by the genetics. It is not at the individual level. Individual level you cannot exactly point out like this, but in a general population level we can say about 50% of IQ scores could be contributed by the genetics and other 50% could be roughly by the environment. So, that is called heritability. It is always discussed in the context of a population, not individuals. So, importantly, this heritability estimates applies to the groups, not individuals. and it does not mean that half of one's person intelligence is genetic. So, at the individual level we cannot translate that and say half of my intelligence is by my genetics, but at the population level we can say, because population level lot of other factors influences that, you know. So, this kind of concepts are discussed in the population level. Now, let us look into how intelligence is explained, what are its different types and categories through some of the theories of intelligence. So, we will talk about these 4 theories. The last theory also has one or two theories under this concept of multiple intelligence. So, let us look into some of these theories. The first theory is called as a Spearman 2-factor theory. So, this was proposed by Spearman, and he said people differ in how they perceive their intellectual strength. Some may see themselves as skilled in writing, but weak in maths, while others may excel in science or possess a broad sense of intelligence. This variation reflects a long-standing psychological debate: is intelligence a single general ability or a collection of specific abilities? Okay. So, what Spearman says, these are the 2 factors involved in it. Evidence show that individuals who perform well in one type of mental task, such as verbal or mathematical, tend to perform well on other tasks, indicating a common underlying ability. What Spearman found, that it seems based on the data that people have a common or a general ability of intelligence, that if you perform well in one task, you are likely to do well in many other tasks. So, there is a general ability that is there, which is called as a general intelligence. So, British psychologist Charles Spearman proposed that intelligence consists of a general factor called G factor, general intelligence. So, if you are intelligent, means intelligence in most of the things, general intelligence. And he also says, apart from this general intelligence, there may be some specific abilities, S factor. In certain tasks, apart from this general capacity, you need certain specific abilities also to do certain specific type of tasks. So, therefore, it is called as a 2-factor theory, G factor and S factors. He observed that people who perform well on mental ability tests did well on many other tasks, suggesting presence of maybe a common underlying general intelligence or G factor, which influences the performance in lot of varieties of tasks. At the same time, Spearman recognized specific abilities unique to particular tasks. For example, for mathematics, there may be some unique specific abilities required apart from general ability and verbal skills. For verbal skills, apart from general ability, you may need certain specific verbal skill related abilities and so on. They also affect test outcome. So, using factor analysis, which is a statistical method, Charles Spearman identified these 2 components of intelligence: a general intelligence factor G factor and specific factors unique to particular tasks. When you do any task, there may be some specific abilities required apart from some general intelligence that is required. So, he said intelligence may have these 2 factors. So, G factor represents the broad ability, S factors or specific factors apply to particular skill and task. Modern intelligence test, most of the IQ tests that are done, such as Stanford Binet intelligence test, Wechsler tests or scales, are designed to measure this general intelligence. Most of these scales, even in today, measures this general ability, which is reflected in the IQ scores. Spearman proposed that individuals' differences in general intelligence might stem from variation in the mental energy. So, he said this is more like people have different mental energies. People with high general intelligence, they have more mental energies. People with low general ability may have less mental energy, suggesting that a G represents the strength or efficiency of mental functioning. He compared it like a car's engine. Some brains are simply more powerful and efficient than others according to this model. So, higher G means more powerful brains as compared to who are less in that. However, the meaning and existence of G has been highly controversial and debated, whether actually such thing exists or not. The debate arises because G implies that some people are inherently smarter than others, a notion which seems to be an elitist notion, that some people are, simply have higher capacity in the brain as compared to others, which seems to be problematic for a lot of people, because then Before doing anything, people are different in terms of intelligence. For example, Stephen Jay Gould argued that G is merely a statistical artifact, claiming that ranking individuals along a single dimension of intelligence is not right. However, in contrast, other people such as Gottfredson and other critics countered that G is likely not an illusion. There may be possibility of it. It is not an illusion, as intelligence test item consistently showed positive intercorrelation regardless of content, supporting the idea of common factor. So, there have been people in both sides. Some people argued that this is more of a statistical artifact where such general ability may not exist, but some people says, but consistently data shows such abilities exist. So, people have been debating about that. Spearman himself acknowledged that G general ability may not explain all the intelligence aspects. Therefore, he said this second factor, that specific abilities are also important, unique to each task. You may have general ability high, but you still may poorly perform some specific task because you do not have specific abilities in those tasks. So, for instance, he said success in spatial reasoning problem, for example, imagining something in the space related reasoning problems, depends on both general problem solving ability or G factor and specific spatial skills to imagine things in the space. That specific ability is also required. A person may have high G general ability, but still perform poorly in such tasks because their space related aptitude is not high. So, it is possible. Even Spearman also acknowledged that. So, that was one theory that says intelligence has two factors, one is general intelligence and one is specific abilities, but focus was on general intelligence, that people have a general intelligence ability, G factor, which is high for some people, low for some people, which is typically till date are reflected in the IQ tests. Then there was another theory called theory of fluid and crystallized intelligence. This theory was proposed by Raymond B. Cattell and later expanded by John Horn. So, they refined Spearman's concept of general intelligence by suggesting that intelligence is not a single unified ability, but rather consistent of two distinct yet interrelated components. He says intelligence is not just about G general ability, but intelligence has two distinct interrelated components. There are two components involved in it in terms of types of intelligence. There are two types of intelligence according to this model. One is called as a fluid intelligence, another is called as crystallized intelligence. What does that mean? So, fluid intelligence refers to capacity to reason, solve novel problems, think abstract. These are all independent of pure learning experience. It involves flexible thinking, pattern recognition, logical analysis and so on. So, fluid intelligence is typically processing ability. It does not depend on your knowledge or how much you have read and so on. Prior learning and experience is not directly involved here. It is your capacity to reason. It is a pure reasoning ability. You can reason without having prior knowledge in something, logically understanding something, solving a problems, thinking pattern recognition, thinking abstractly. So, this may not require you to have lot of knowledge and so on. So, these are typical processing ability of your mind, So, they are called as fluid intelligence. Key characteristics of this involves reasoning and problem solving, independence of acquired knowledge or cultural background. There is no direct connection to whatever knowledge you have and cultural background. This is culture free, relies heavily on working memory, processing speed and alternative attention control, peaks in early adulthood and gradually declines with age. They become peak at the early adulthood and with the age it may decline, your ability to reason and so on based on aging and so on. So, that is called fluid intelligence. It may, for example, required when solving a novel puzzle, logical problem, identifying patterns in abstract figure, reasoning through unfamiliar mathematical or spatial problem and so on. So, that is called typical fluid intelligence, which is also a lot of it is reflected in the IQ test and so on. On the other hand, crystallized intelligence is about your accumulated knowledge, experience. This is reflected by that. It's the accumulated knowledge, facts and skills acquired through education and experience. It represents application of prior learning to current problems. So, whatever you have learned, can you apply that? So, that is crystallized intelligence. So, it depends on culture, education, environment, whatever education knowledge if you have, so you can apply that knowledge in certain context. So, that is crystallized intelligence. It involves verbal comprehension, vocabulary, general knowledge, learned skills. So, these are all learned. Increases or remains stable throughout the adulthood as long as individuals remain intellectually active. As long as someone remains intellectually active, crystallized intelligence will keep growing. It also reflects wisdom and expertise that comes with experience. So, for example, understanding language, using rich vocabulary, solving arithmetic general knowledge questions, these are all reflection of your crystallized intelligence. These are all result of your learning experience. There is a strong evidence that support the distinction between these two types of intelligence. Studies show that fluid intelligence, those involving reasoning and problem solving in novel situations, tend to decline with age. So, these are two different intelligence, which is kind of also backed by some evidence that fluid intelligence tend to decline with age, because as people grow older, these abilities of reasoning and problem solving generally decreases. However, crystallized intelligence, which reflects the accumulated knowledge and experience, remain active or even increase with the age, because with the increase of age you accumulate more knowledge and experience. So, that is why in terms of that also shows these are two different independent kind of types of intelligence. In fact, longitudinal research indicates that crystallized intelligence often increases in older adulthoods, because we accumulate more knowledge and experience. So, it becomes more in older adults as compared to younger adults. Moreover, fluid intelligence is more strongly correlated with G than crystallized intelligence. So, fluid intelligence is more strongly related to G factor or general intelligence that we talked about in the Spearman's theory, which is a general ability of processing information. Crystallized is not very strongly related to G. It is more about your accumulated knowledge. Suggests that fluid ability accurately reflects core mental capacity or mental engine originally described by the Spearman. So, that is called that's another idea of intelligence, that there could be two separate categories of intelligence. Then there is another theory proposed by Thurston's theory of primary mental abilities. Thurston was one of the first theorists who provided an alternative to Spearman's G theory of intelligence. He also proposed an alternative to G factor theory of Spearman's theory. While Spearman proposed that a single general factor underlies all intellectual abilities, Thurston argued that intelligence is composed of several distinct independent mental abilities rather than one overarching factors. So, he was not in agreement with Spearman that there is a general one intelligence. He said there are multiple such several distinct such different types of intelligence could be there. Thurston, he was also a psychometrician and a pioneer in factor analysis, disagreed with the Spearman's idea that a single general intelligence explains all cognitive performance. He believed that intellectual performance results from several relatively independent abilities that can vary from person to person. So, there can be multiple such abilities, not just one ability that reflects intelligence. So, he said there could be 7 such abilities which are reflection of intelligence. One is verbal comprehension, word fluency, number facility, spatial visualization, associative memory, perceptual speed, reasoning and so on. So, these are 7 abilities, he said, not just one general. So, these are very brief description of each of them. So, verbal comprehension means it is understanding and reasoning verbal material, ability to comprehend language. So, this is an ability related to language, how much you understand the language, comprehend the language, use the language. It is reflected in the vocabulary, reading comprehension and so on. Word fluency is about producing words rapidly, facilitating using, manipulating language. Again, this is also related to language, how fast you can produce words and rapidity and so on. Number facility is about performing mathematics related abilities like arithmetic operation quickly and accurately, solving simple mathematical problems and so on. Spatial visualization is about mentally manipulating shapes and spatial patterns. It's more related to imagination and how can you organize objects in the space and so on. Visualizing objects would look when rotated and so on. It's more about visualization ability. Associative memory is about learning and recalling paired association. For example, remembering word pairs or faces and names. How you can associate two things and how well you can remember them. Perceptual speed is about quickly perceiving visual details and similarities and differences. How quickly you can perceive visual details, perceptual, to look at things and visually whatever features, visual features that object has, how quickly you can process that. Visual details and similarities and differences. For example, identifying matching symbols or spotting errors and so on. Reasoning is about inductive and deductive reasoning, discovering rules and principles. For example, solving analogies, logical problems and so on. So, these are the 7 primary abilities he talked about. He said we do not have just one general G factor, but we have these 7 primary abilities. Now, then there are theories of multiple intelligences. This theory also talks about multiple things, but again this is not like a lot of these are related to an expression of typical IQ score related factors, typical verbal and numeric arithmetic processing ability and so on. We will talk about this. So, even though it talks about multiple factors in the abilities, this may not be clearly defined in the context of multiple intelligences. So, then there are theories of multiple intelligence. This says there is no one intelligence as such. So, you have one general intelligence that you are intelligent in everything, not something does not work like that. So, there is one main difference between Spearman's G factor with other theories of multiple intelligence, that how intelligence is structured, whether it is one general ability or many independent abilities. So, according to multiple intelligence, there are many independent intelligences, very different domains of life. Theories of multiple intelligence is not about one single ability, but multiple independent intelligence, as we said. Many theories contend that concept of G cannot fully explain individual differences in the intellectual successes. For instance, people may display exceptional ability in some areas yet struggle in others. If G is something that determines most of the things, then it is very difficult to explain this. Intelligence cannot be reduced to a single score, since there are many ways of being smart. So, that is the basic idea of multiple intelligence theories. Even Spearman also kind of understood that, but then he gave more importance to the general factor. Specific abilities he also talked about, which are kind of in line with a lot of these ideas of multiple intelligence, but his focus was more of some extra abilities that you need in for some tests, but general ability is the main factor. So, that is what still the importance was given to the G factor. However, proponent of multiple intelligence go further, maintain that G is only one component. Spearman says G is the main component and some specific abilities may be required, but proponent says G is the only one type of intelligence. There are many other types of intelligences. So, that is how it is fundamentally different. Even Thurston theory that we talked about, 7 primary abilities, is typically may not be considered under multiple intelligence, because Thurston abilities are still interrelated. Most of them are interrelated, similar type of things, only different names are given. Later research showed that Thurston's abilities are very highly correlated. They can be explained by a general intelligence. A lot of these factors are very similar to factors that comes under general intelligence only. In contrast, multiple intelligence theory argues abilities are independent. They are very different types. Thurston focused strictly on academic cognitive processes related intelligence, only arithmetic, language related and the space related intelligence. These are typically academic cognitive processes measured by pen and paper pencil, typically in the IQ tests. Multiple intelligence theories expand their definition of smart to many non-academic domains like physical coordination, social navigation and so on. So, typically that theory cannot be considered under multiple intelligence, even though he talked about multiple abilities. So, one very prominent theory of multiple intelligence is called Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. Howard Gardner somewhere in 1980s proposed this theory of multiple intelligence. It became highly influential in shaping lot of these modern educational theories and practices. Gardner proposed that human intelligence is not a single general ability, but a collection of distinct frames of mind, each representing an unique independent way of processing. Each intelligence is unique and different way of processing information. These are not general intelligence and lot of sub factors under it. Each intelligence is unique and distinct frames of mind. So, therefore, multiple intelligence. Most of the theories are talking about different expression of G factors and some factors which are correlated with the G factors. So, that is the fundamental difference. Gardner proposed that mental abilities, when if you want to qualify as a different intelligence, it should meet several criteria, which were not met by other theories like Thurston and so on. One should be there should be neuropsychological evidence that different intelligence should be isolable through brain damage studies, that if one intelligence get damaged, other remains intact. So, therefore, that is why neurologically they are different. So, evidence should be of neuropsychological evidence should be there to call two intelligence as different. Second is distinct intelligence should be evident in individual with exceptional talent, such as autistic savants. So, this distinct intelligence should be also reflected in some individual who show it very exceptionally. For example, in some exceptionally autistic children show exceptional intelligence in something, who display extraordinary skill in certain narrow areas. For example, recalling complex numerical data. Some of the autistic children can, very good in some processing numerical or calculating, numerical data and so on. So, it will be reflected that something is exceptionally short, means this is a very different types of intelligence. Finally, Gardner emphasized that each intelligence should make evolutionary sense. That is, it should contribute to an organism's survival or reproductive success by enhancing adaptive behavior. So, evolutionary sense means what? Each intelligence should help you to adapt to social life or whatever life you are leading. So, that it helps you to increase the reproductive success. So, this was his criteria to call two intelligence as different intelligence if they have these criteria. So, Howard Gardner, although he has not produced lot of empirical evidence, but he says there are 8 distinct intelligence. Initially he said 7, then 8, and later I think he added one more also. So, but 8 distinct intelligence. These are all different types of intelligence, not one intelligence. This include linguistics, logical mathematical, spatial, musical, body kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal and naturalistic intelligence. We will talk about each of them very briefly. These are very different types of intelligence, not like one general intelligence and expression of that. He also tentatively suggested a 9th one called existential intelligence, which is not discussed much, which basically means the capacity to contemplate profound philosophical questions such as meaning in life. So, if some people are good in those aspects of contemplating philosophical questions such as meaning in life, they have higher existential intelligence and so on. But this is not popularly discussed in most of the text and so on. So, what are these 8 type of intelligence? So, let us just briefly look at it. Linguistic intelligence means what? It is about speaking and writing well. Use of language, some people are very intelligent. For example, people who are writers, who are poets, storytellers, their linguistic intelligence is very high. They may not be very high in mathematics and other things, but linguistic intelligence is very high. They know how to use language efficiently, how to use language to create stories and poems and so on, and definitely they are different from most of the normal human beings in terms of how efficient they are in terms of using language. So, that is called linguistic intelligence. Then comes logical mathematical intelligence. So, that is a typical mathematics related intelligence, using logic, mathematical skills to solve problems such as scientific questions and so on. Most of the IQ test focuses only this aspect. Other intelligences are not covered by most of the IQ tests. Then comes spatial intelligence, space related, thinking and reasoning about objects in 3-dimensional space. So, people who are good in spatial intelligence, they may be good in designing objects in the space, arranging things in the object or in a room and so on, in a particular space. So, some people are very good in designing things or how to decorate objects or a particular space. So, they are very good with space related things, how to arrange objects in the space, in the 3-dimensional space. So, that is called spatial intelligence. Some people are good in that, some people have higher intelligence in that. Then comes musical intelligence. These people have higher ability to perform, understand and enjoy music. They have better understanding of music, they can learn music faster, they can use music, create music and so on. So, people who are good with music, music directors, singers and so on, who understand music. So, they have kind of higher intelligence in the understanding and use of music and so on. So, that is called musical intelligence. Then comes body kinesthetic intelligence. It is about using body efficiently. It is about manipulating the body in sports, dance, other physical endeavors. People who are good dancers, who are sportsmen, they have higher body kinesthetic intelligence because they can use the body more efficiently. Then comes interpersonal intelligence. Interpersonal means it is in the social context, in the context of relating with other people, understanding and interacting effectively with other people. Some people are good at interacting with other people in the social intelligence aspects, that people, they are simply smart in dealing with other people, connecting with other people. So, that is called interpersonal intelligence. Then comes intrapersonal intelligence, which means understanding and processing insight into self. These are the people who are very good at knowing themselves. They have a lot of self awareness. What is their strength, what is their weaknesses, they know very good about themselves. So, they have more self regulation about their behavior and so on. So, that is called intrapersonal intelligence. Some people are good at regulating themselves, understanding themselves and so on. Then comes naturalistic intelligence, which is also added by him, recognizing, identifying, understanding animals, plants and other living things. It is about understanding and affinity towards nature and other objects, other animals and so on. So, these are, he proposed that people differ in all this intelligence. Some people may be high in some of these and low in other things, because they are very different intelligences. Now, Gardner, this model has a lot of influence on education initially, inspiring teachers to design lessons that align with students' individual intelligence profiles and capacities. For example, a teacher might use body kinesthetic methods like forming groups physically to represent numbers to teach arithmetic to students who are more physically oriented than mathematically inclined. However, some people have used that some student may be different in their intelligences, so use those type of things to teach them. However, Gardner himself expressed reservation about such practices. He cautioned that teaching away from weaker skills might hinder improvement. So, if there are certain skills they are weak in, if you do not use that method, probably they become more weaker in that. So, that may not serve purpose. So, it is like neglecting the weak muscles. So, that may not be very productive in that sense. So, sometimes people practicing that also, sometimes who are not good at something may become better in that. Furthermore, empirical studies also show little evidence that matching such kind of method to teaching learning may not have a very good outcomes in a lot of contexts. Now, the scientific community's reaction to Gardner theory has been mixed. Some people while agree that individuals differ in lot of intellectual strength and intelligence may manifest in multiple forms. They also noted that Gardner's model lacks clarity and empirical testability. So, empirically finding evidence was one of the problematic area with this theory, where some people criticize some of the aspects of the theory. For example, some of the criticism we will talk about it here. One is related to conceptual criticism. Critics argue that it is unclear why certain abilities qualifies as native intelligence and while others not. For example, why not include humor intelligence, why not include memory intelligence? If you want to create diverse intelligences, this may also be intelligences, why you have not included that? Some scholars argue that certain categories resemble talents or physical skills more than cognitive intelligence. For example, body kinesthetic intelligence may be more related to physical skills and talents rather than typical intelligence. It may also reflect physical skills rather than mental processing and so on. So, that was another criticism to some of this aspect of the theory. Another argument of this or criticism of this theory was lack of formal measurement. Major criticism is that Gardner's intelligences have not been formally measured or validated by him through any questionnaires or proper measurement instrument. Not widely standardized tools are available to measure them. Difficult to scientifically test and falsify a lot of this theory. So, that was also another criticism of the theory. Some people also question the independence of this, what he claimed, that independent intelligences. So, Gardner claimed that intelligences are independent. However, research shows the measures of lot of these abilities are often positively correlated. This suggests they may reflect a common general factor and so on. Some people argued that also they may also be correlated to each other. So, pure independence is questioned here, which may also reflect maybe a general intelligence still explained better. Now, some evidence from autistic savants, like who are very exceptionally talented in certain areas, autistic children. Gardner cited autistic savant as support for a lot of these intelligence theories. However, research indicates savants often score higher on general intelligence measure than other individuals with autism. Their specialized abilities may partly stem from general intelligence and so on. So, a lot of this empirical evidence is questioned about this particular theory. Conceptually, it may look that there are different intelligences, but then evidence wise there is a lack of evidence for this theory. So, that was some of the criticism. So, there was another theory called as triarchic model, which can also fit some extent to the concept of multiple intelligence, but here the focus was more on how the different processing mode of processing rather than content like body, musical and so on. So, this was proposed by Robert Sternberg, who proposed this model of triarchic model of intelligence. He argued that intelligence encompasses more than general intelligence. He again argued against this only general intelligence, just like Gardner proposed. His model identifies three distinct types of intelligence. Here it is more of a types of intelligence, different modes of processing, and each contributing to different aspect of problem solving and successes. One he called as analytical intelligence, second is practical intelligence, third is creative intelligence. So, let us look into each of them. Analytical intelligence is the ability to reason logically and think abstractly. So, that is typical logical mathematical intelligence that Gardner talked about and general intelligence talked about by the other theorist. So, that is typical IQ score measures this aspect, analytical intelligence, logical reasoning, abstract thinking and so on. It is what traditional IQ test and academic exam measures. Sternberg noted that psychology has long been dominated by this G-centric bias, overvaluing this form of intelligence. Most of the intelligence theories and intelligence tests only focused on this type of intelligence. So, this is what Sternberg said. He said beyond this there are other two types also which are not focused in the context of intelligence. One is called as a practical intelligence. So, these are like tacit intelligence, sometimes called as street smarts, involve solving real world problems, particularly social and everyday context. Some people are smart in the real social context. They may not be good at mathematics and other academic intelligence, but they may be very smart and good in the real world social context and solving problems. So, they are also in a layman term called as street smarts. It includes understanding and managing people effectively, and that overlaps with social intelligence. It is very similar to the concept of social intelligence. Such people are good in understanding and managing other people effectively. Sternberg research has developed measures to assess practical intelligence in workplaces and military settings. So, he also developed measures to how to measure this aspect and so on. Third one is called creative intelligence, that is related to creativity. He said that is also another type of intelligence, even though it may not correlate with the typical analytical intelligence. Creativity is the ability to generate novel and effective solution to problems. So, it allows individuals to think innovatively, such as composing original music or writing moving poetry and so on. Okay. creativity, originality and the novel solutions and so on. Sternberg found that creative and practical intelligences predict real world successes. He said in the real world context, these two are actually more important, creative intelligence and practical intelligence. In the academic world, probably the analytical intelligence is more important, but in the real world context, they predict more real world successes, such as job performance, better than analytical intelligence alone. So, if you just have analytical intelligence and you do not have this intelligence, probably you may not be that successful in the real world context or job context. Other intelligences, practical and creative intelligence actually adds more probability of success and so on. So, this is another perspective of looking at multiple intelligences. Critics argue that Sternberg claim again, some argue that this theory also does not have very strong empirical support, especially independence of practical intelligence from general intelligence and so on. Gottfredson and Jensen contend that practical intelligence may simply be a specialized form of G and rather than a distinct contrast. Some people keep arguing that the other forms of intelligence that you are talking about may be actually their reflection of general intelligence. Sternberg's practical intelligence test might measure job knowledge rather than independence, problem solving ability, since those are more job knowledge naturally perform better. These are some of the arguments given against the independence of these three factors. Moreover, the causal relationship is unclear. Practical knowledge could improve job performance, or strong job performance could enhance practical knowledge. What is the direction? Creative intelligence appears linked to G, all different types of theories that we discussed. Psychologists still continue to debate on the role of importance of general intelligence. A lot of psychologists believe that there is a general intelligence, and a lot of these other things are a specific expression of that general intelligence. Spearman's theory emphasizes single overarching general factor of all which influence cognitive tasks. Gardner's and Sternberg's theories moves in a different direction, arguing that intelligence is multidimensional and that traditional IQ test failed to capture many important real world aspects of human intelligence. So, Gardner and Sternberg, who are proponent of multiple intelligences, they said a lot of these IQ tests only focus on particular type of intelligence, that is analytical type of intelligence, rational logical thinking, and lot of other theories and tests, they simply ignore many other dimensions of intelligence which are more important in the real world context, such as practical intelligence, or creative intelligence and so on. So, despite their influences, Gardner's and Sternberg's models remain incompletely tested, empirical evidence is still questioned. Empirical evidence for distinct independent intelligence are still limited. There are some evidence, but the evidence are limited. Researchers disagree on whether such divisions truly exist or not. So, there are proponents who agree multiple intelligences, some proponents who agree on a general concept of intelligence. So, there is still not very clear cut consensus around this whole idea of one intelligence versus multiple intelligences, or whether all intellectual abilities ultimately share common general intelligence. Thus, the theory of multiple intelligence remains controversial in that sense. While individuals clearly have unique intellectual strength and weaknesses, evidence suggests that these abilities are not entirely independent or one another, and maybe a general intelligence factor may still underlie them all. So, here again it is not very conclusive here. There are proponents to general intelligence and there are proponents to multiple intelligences. Multiple intelligence can explain a lot of real world functioning. There are many other ways of being smart, at least conceptually and intuitively they make a lot of sense. Empirical evidence are still limited, but the concept of general intelligence has a lot of empirical evidence, and mostly they focus on particular type of processing of information like logical and rational processing, and most of the IQ test that we will talk about those testing in the next lecture are reflection of this general factor. So with this I stop here. Thank you.